This training is entitled Introduction to Domestic Violence. Domestic violence is a pattern of controlling behaviors carried out by one person in an intimate relationship to maintain power and control over their partner. Partners may be married, not married, heterosexual, gay, or lesbian, living together, separated, or dating. Violence takes many forms and can happen all the time or once in a while. Abuse is not an accident. It does not happen because someone was stressed out, drinking, or using drugs. Abusers have learned to abuse using their power to get what they want. The abuse may be physical, sexual, emotional, economic, and psychological. According to Better Intervention Standards for the state of Michigan, domestic violence is a pattern of controlling behaviors, some of which are criminal. That includes, but not limited to, physical assaults, sexual assaults, emotional abuse, isolation, economic coercion, threats, stalking, and intimidation. These behaviors are used by the batterer in effort to control the intimate partner. The behavior may be directed at others with the effect of controlling the intimate partner. Battering is a choice. It is used by one person in an intimate relationship to maintain power and control over their partner. Domestic violence crosses all ethnic, racial, age, national origin, sexual orientation, religious, socioeconomic lines. Domestic violence can happen to anybody. In fact, study shows that 1/5 to 1/3 of all women will be physically assaulted by a partner or ex-partner in their lifetime. In heterosexual relationships, 95% of victims are female and 95% of perpetrators are male. But that is not to say that all men are abusers and that there are no female abusers. In same-sex relationships, domestic violence happens with the same statistical frequency as in heterosexual relationships. Women living in poverty experience violence by their partner at a higher rate, partially because they have fewer options. When we talk about the rate of domestic violence, we're really talking about the rate that people report being abused. There are women who have more options or um, choose not to report, and so they are not always represented by the numbers that we give. So let's talk about domestic violence victims or survivors. Anyone can be a victim. Victims can be any age, sex, race, culture, religion, education, employment, or marital status. Although both men and women can be abused, again, most victims are women. Children in homes where there's domestic violence are more likely to be abused and neglected. Most children in these homes know about the violence. Even if a child is not physically harmed, they may have emotional and behavioral problems. Studies show that children who witness domestic violence suffer the same effects of the violence as the intended victim. No one deserves to be abused, and the only person who's responsible for the abuse is the abuser. There's no typical abuser. In public, they may appear friendly and loving to their partner and family. They often only abuse behind closed doors. They also try to hide the abuse by causing injuries that can be hidden and do not need medical attention. Abusers often have low self-esteem. They don't take responsibility for their actions. They often blame the victim for causing the violence, and in most cases, the abusers are male. So, why do we use the term survivor sometime versus the word victim? We use the term survivor due to our emphasis on empowerment advocacy. This happens when the advocate offers support, resources, advocacy, information, and education. This is a way of recognizing the strength, courage, and survival strategies of domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. Not all women who have experienced domestic or sexual violence see themselves as survivors. Remember, domestic violence and sexual assault is something that happens to individuals, but it does not define who they are. We're a movement, and our work is different than other traditional social service in that we focus on the survivor's strength. We do not believe that we are the experts on the life of the survivor. We believe survivors are the experts on their own life, and they have a right to decide what's best for them. Our programs are survivor driven and not service driven. It's not as much about what services we offer, but how we can be there for that survivor. We understand that violence can happen to any of us if someone chooses to make us their victim. And we are non directive in our approach to working with survivors. What that means is we listen to what they want and we take our cues from what they tell us. Instead of viewing victims or survivors as sick or pathological, we believe that survivors are simply reacting in adaptive ways to oppressive societal conditions, restrictive sex roles, and the abusive intimate partner in their lives. So let's talk about the power and control wheel. It's called the Duluth model. Physical and sexual assaults or threats to commit them are the most apparent forms of domestic violence and are usually the actions that allow others to become aware of the problem. However, regular use of other abusive behaviors by the abuser, when reinforced by one or more of acts of physical violence, make up the larger system of abuse. Although physical assaults may occur only once or occasionally, they instill threat of future violent attacks and they allow the abuser to take control of the person's life and circumstances. The power and control diagram is a particularly helpful tool in understanding the overall pattern of abuse and violent behaviors, which are used by an abuser to establish and maintain control over their partner. Very often, one or more violent incidents are accompanied by an array of these other types of abuse. They are less identified, yet firmly establish the pattern of intimidation and control in a relationship. So let's break down the power and control wheel. They use intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, minimizing, denying, and blaming, using children, economic abuse, male privilege, and coercion and threats. So, using intimidation, making her feel afraid by using looks, actions, gestures, smashing things, destroying property, abusing pets, and displaying weapons. Using emotional abuse, putting her down, making her feel bad about herself, calling her names, making her think she's crazy, playing mind games, humiliating her, making her feel guilty. Using isolation, controlling what she does, who she sees and talks to, what she reads, where she goes, limiting her outside involvement, and using jealousy to justify their actions. Minimizing, denying, and blaming, making light of the abuse and not taking her concerns about it seriously, saying the abuse didn't happen, shifting responsibility for abusive behavior, or saying that it's the victim who caused the abuse. Using children, making her feel guilty about the children, using the children to relay messages, and using visitation to harass, threatening to take the children away. Using male privilege, or sometimes even female privilege, treating the other person like a servant, making all the big decisions, acting like master of the castle, and being the one to define what the men and women's roles are in the relationship. When I say female privilege, I'm talking about the well used term or phrase, if mama's not happy, no one's happy. And what that does is give some women who abuse permission to terrorize their family and make everyone else miserable until they fall into line and do what she wants. Using economic abuse, preventing the other person from getting or keeping a job, making them ask for money, giving an allowance, taking the other person's money, or not letting them know about or have access to the family income. Using coercion or threats, making or carrying out threats to hurt the other person, threatening to leave, threatening to commit suicide, or to report them to welfare, or making them or trying to make them drop charges and making the other person do illegal things. Luckily, in the state of Michigan, if the police are called and they see evidence that an assault has taken place, it's not the responsibility of the victim to bring charges against their abuser. It's the state who then brings charges against the abuser. And so they don't have to make that decision whether or not they're going to um, continue to press charges or drop the charges. So, a question that we hear all the time is, why do they stay? But there's barriers to leaving. One of the most frustrating things for people outside of a battering relationship is to try and understand, why didn't she just leave? The most important thing to keep in mind is that extreme emotional abuse is always present in a domestic violence situation. On average, an abused woman will try to leave her partner 6 to 8 times. The reason they return or stay in a relationship vary from case to case. Some of these include situational factors, economic dependence, fear of greater physical danger, fear of being hunted down and suffering worse, survival, fear of emotional damage to their children, fear of losing custody of their children, lack of alternative housing. She has nowhere to go, or is just unaware of what's available. Lack of job skills, social isolation, and lack of information about her alternatives, lack of understanding from family and friends, police, and even their ministers, etc. Negative response from community, police, courts, social workers. Fear of involvement in the court process. Fear of the unknown. Better the devil you know than the devil that you don't. Fear of ambivalence over making formidable life changes. Acceptable violence. Ties to the community. Ties to her home and belonging. Family pressure. Fear of her abuser doing something to get her reported to welfare, and time needed to plan and prepare to leave. And then there's the emotional factors, insecurity, loyalty, pity, wanting to help, fear that the other person will commit suicide, denial that the abuse is even as bad as what it actually is, love, that's usually the number one reason, guilt, shame and humiliation, the shame that the victim or survivor carries that actually should belong to the abuser. unfounded optimism, thinking that things will get better, learned helplessness, false hope, guilt, responsibility, insecurity, guilt about the failure of their marriage or relationship, demolished self-esteem. They believe the lies that their abuser have told them. Lack of emotional support and simple exhaustion. They're just too tired to do anything different at this time. Then there's their personal beliefs. Parenting, needing to be a partner for the kids. A crazy father is better than no father at all. Or he's not a good husband or partner, or she's not a good wife or partner, but they're an excellent parent to their children. Religious and extended family pressures, duty. When I got married, I said, till death do us part, so I'm going to stay. Responsibility, because it's up to that person to work things out. Belief in the American dream of growing up and living happily ever after. Identity. Sometimes their identity is tied to who that person is. The belief that marriage is forever. The belief that violence is the way that all partners relate. And this is often because this is what they experienced growing up, so they believe it to be true. And religious and cultural beliefs. And so I'm going to show you a video of Leslie Morgensteiner and her TED Talk about her domestic violence situation.
I'm here today to talk about a disturbing question, which has an equally disturbing answer. My topic is the secrets of domestic violence. And the question I'm going to tackle is the one question everyone always asks. Why does she stay? Why would anyone stay with a man who beats her? I'm not a psychiatrist, a social worker, or an expert in domestic violence. I'm just one woman with a story to tell. I was 22. I had just graduated from Harvard College. I'd moved to New York City for my first job as a writer and editor at 17 magazine. I had my first apartment, my first little green American Express card, and I had a very big secret. My secret was that I had this gun loaded with hollow point bullets pointed at my head by the man who I thought was my soulmate many, many times. The man who I loved more than anybody on earth held a gun to my head and threatened to kill me more times than I can even remember. I'm here to tell you the story of crazy love, a psychological trap disguised as love, one that millions of women and even a few men fall into every year. It may even be your story. I don't look like a typical domestic violence survivor. I have a BA in English from Harvard College, an MBA in marketing from Wharton Business School. I spent most of my career working for Fortune 500 companies, including Johnson & Johnson, Leo Burnett, and the Washington Post. I've been married for almost 20 years to my second husband, and we have 3 kids together. My dog is a black lab, and I drive a Honda Odyssey minivan. So my first message for you is that domestic violence happens to everyone. All races, all religions, all income and education levels. It's everywhere. And my second message is that everyone thinks domestic violence happens to women, that it's a women's issue. Not exactly. Over 85% of abusers are men. And domestic abuse happens only in intimate, interdependent, long-term relationships. In other words, in families. The last place we would want or expect to find violence, which is one reason domestic abuse is so confusing. I would have told you myself that I was the last person on earth who would stay with a man who beats me. But in fact, I was a very typical victim because of my age. I was 22. And in the United States, women ages 16 to 24 are 3 times as likely to be domestic violence victims as women of other ages. And over 500 women and girls this age are killed every year by abusive partners, boyfriends and husbands in the United States. I was also a very typical victim because I knew nothing about domestic violence, its warning signs or its patterns. I met Connor on a cold, rainy January night. He sat next to me on the New York City subway, and he started chatting me up. He told me 2 things. One was that he, too, had just graduated from an Ivy League school, and that he worked at a very impressive Wall Street bank. But what made the biggest impression on me that first meeting was that he was smart and funny, and he looked like a farm boy. He had these big cheeks, these big apple cheeks, and this wheat blonde hair, and he seemed so sweet. One of the smartest things Connor did from the very beginning was to create the illusion that I was the dominant partner in the relationship. He did this, especially at the beginning, by idolizing me. We started dating, and he loved everything about me. That I was smart, that I'd gone to Harvard, that I was passionate about helping teenage girls and my job. He wanted to know everything about my family and my childhood, my hopes and dreams. Connor believed in me as a writer and a woman in a way that no one else ever had. And he also created a magical atmosphere of trust between us by confessing his secret, which was that as a very young boy, starting at age 4, he had been savagely and repeatedly physically abused by his stepfather. And the abuse had gotten so bad that he had had to drop out of school in 8th grade, even though he was very smart. And he'd spent almost 20 years rebuilding his life, which is why that Ivy League degree and the Wall Street job and his bright, shiny future meant so much to him. If you had told me that this smart, funny, sensitive man who adored me would one day dictate whether or not I wore makeup, how short my skirts were, where I lived, what jobs I took, who my friends were, and where I spent Christmas, I would have laughed at you. Because there was not a hint of violence or control or anger in Connor at the beginning. I didn't know that the first stage in any domestic violence relationship is to seduce and charm the victim. I also didn't know that the second step is to isolate the victim. Now, Connor did not come home one day and announce, hey, all this Romeo and Juliet stuff has been great, but I need to move into the next phase where I isolate you and I abuse you. So I need to get you out of this apartment where the neighbors can hear you scream, and out of this city where you have friends and family and coworkers who can see the bruises. Instead, Connor came home one Friday evening, and he told me that he had quit his job that day, his dream job. And he said that he had quit his job because of me, because I had made him feel so safe and loved that he didn't need to prove himself on Wall Street anymore. And he just wanted to get out of the city and away from his abusive, dysfunctional family and move to a tiny town in New England where he could start his life over with me by his side. Now, the last thing I wanted to do was leave New York and my dream job. But I thought you made sacrifices for your soulmate. So I agreed, and I quit my job, and Connor and I left Manhattan together. I had no idea I was falling into crazy love, that I was walking headfirst into a carefully laid physical, financial, and psychological trap. The next step in the domestic violence pattern is to introduce the threat of violence and see how she reacts. And here's where those guns come in. As soon as we moved to New England, that place where Connor was supposed to feel so safe, he bought 3 guns. He kept one in the glove compartment of our car. He kept one under the pillows on our bed. And the third one he kept in his pocket at all times. And he said that he needed those guns because of the trauma he'd experienced as a young boy. He needed them to feel protected. but those guns were really a message for me. And even though he hadn't raised a hand to me, my life was already in grave danger every minute of every day. Connor first physically attacked me 5 days before our wedding. It was 7 a.m. I still had on my nightgown. I was working on my computer trying to finish a freelance writing assignment, and I got frustrated. And Connor used my anger as an excuse to put both of his hands around my neck and to squeeze so tightly that I could not breathe or scream. And he used the chokehold to hit my head repeatedly against the wall. 5 days later, the 10 bruises on my neck had just faded, and I put on my mother's wedding dress, and I married him. Despite what had happened, I was sure we were going to live happily ever after, because I loved him, and he loved me so much. And he was very, very sorry. He had just been really stressed out by the wedding and by becoming a family with me. It was an isolated incident, and he was never going to hurt me again. It happened twice more on the honeymoon. The first time, I was driving to find a secret beach, and I got lost. And he punched me in the side of my head so hard that the other side of my head repeatedly hit the driver's side window. And then a few days later, driving home from our honeymoon, he got frustrated by traffic, and he threw a cold Big Mac in my face. Connor proceeded to beat me once or twice a week for the next 2.5 years of our marriage. I was mistaken in thinking that I was unique and alone in this situation. 1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence or stalking at some point in her life. And the CDC reports that 15 million children are abused every year. 15 million. So actually, I was in very good company. Back to my question. Why did I stay? The answer is easy. I didn't know he was abusing me. Even though he held those loaded guns to my head, pushed me downstairs, threatened to kill our dog, pulled the key out of the car ignition as I drove down the highway, poured coffee grinds on my head as I dressed for a job interview. I never once thought of myself as a battered wife. Instead, I was a very strong woman in love with a deeply troubled man, and I was the only person on earth who could help Connor face his demons. The other question everybody asks is, why doesn't she just leave? Why didn't I walk out? I could have left any time. To me, this is the saddest and most painful question that people ask, because we victims know something you usually don't. It's incredibly dangerous to leave an abuser, because the final step in the domestic violence pattern is kill her. Over 70% of domestic violence murders happen after the victim has ended the relationship, after she's gotten out, because then the abuser has nothing left to lose. Other outcomes include long-term stalking, even after the abuser remarries, denial of financial resources, and manipulation of the family court system to terrify the victim and her children, who are regularly forced by family court judges to spend unsupervised time with the man who beat their mother. And still we ask, why doesn't she just leave? I was able to leave because of one final sadistic beating that broke through my denial. I realized that the man who I loved so much was going to kill me if I let him. So I broke the silence. I told everyone. The police, my neighbors, my friends and family, total strangers. And I'm here today because you all helped me. We tend to stereotype victims as grisly headlines, self-destructive women, damaged goods. The question, why does she stay, is code for some people for it's her fault for staying, as if victims intentionally choose to fall in love with men intent upon destroying us. But since publishing Crazy Love, I have heard hundreds of stories from men and women who also got out, who learned an invaluable life lesson from what happened, and who rebuilt lives, joyous, happy lives, as employees, wives, and mothers, lives completely free of violence. Like me, because it turns out that I'm actually a very typical domestic violence victim and a typical domestic violence survivor. I remarried a kind and gentle man. We have those 3 kids. I have that black lab, and I have that minivan. What I will never have again, ever, is a loaded gun held to my head by someone who says that he loves me. Now, right now, maybe you're thinking, wow, this is fascinating. Or, wow, how stupid was she? But this whole time, I've actually been talking about you. I promise you, there are several people listening to me right now who are currently being abused, or who were abused as children, or who are abusers themselves. Abuse could be affecting your daughter, your sister, your best friend right now. I was able to end my own crazy love story by breaking the silence. I'm still breaking the silence today. It's my way of helping other victims. And it's my final request of you. Talk about what you heard here. Abuse thrives only in silence. You have the power to end domestic violence simply by shining a spotlight on it. We victims need everyone. We need every one of you to understand the secrets of domestic violence. Show abuse the light of day by talking about it with your children, your coworkers, your friends and family. Recast survivors as wonderful, lovable people with full futures. Recognize the early signs of violence and conscientiously intervene, de-escalate it, show victims a safe way out. Together, we can make our beds, our dinner tables, and our families the safe and peaceful oases they should be. Thank you.
It's good to hear from survivors and their stories and how they've been able to heal and overcome from the domestic violence that has occurred in their life. So let's discuss some myths and facts. Why do domestic violence perpetrators do what they do? Commonly held misconceptions about why batterers batter. People say that it's alcohol or drugs that cause the violence. They believe that stress causes the violence, uncontrollable anger, or the batterer witnessed his father abusing his mother, and that's why they abuse. Factors that does increase the likelihood of male violence against women: ideology of family patriarchy, males' peer support, alcohol consumption or use. And let me get this straight. When someone is using alcohol or drugs, there are those who are more likely to abuse at those times, but they're more likely to abuse because they already believe that it's okay. Alcohol and drugs do not cause people to abuse. What it does, it lowers their inhibitions to listen to that voice inside of them that would stop them on any other time when they're not using, would stop them from being abusers. Exposure to pornographic media, and they hold rigid sex role stereotypes. So why do batterers batter? Because they can. Because it gets them what they want when they want it. And it's opportunity and self-interest. It's all about them and what they want. We live in a society where around the world, at least 1 in every 3 women have been beaten, coerced into sex, or otherwise abused during their lifetime. 78% of stalking victims are women. Women are significantly more likely than men to be stalked by an intimate partner. Intimate partner violence is primarily a crime against women. In 1999, women accounted for 85% of the victims, and those numbers have not changed. On an average, more than 3 women are murdered by their husbands or boyfriends in this country every day. These numbers have not changed since these reports and studies were done. So common characteristics of batterers, they exhibit discrepancy between public and private behavior, use puzzlement to minimize or confuse survivor about the behavior. They externalize by blaming others and using external factors to justify their behavior, using controlling behaviors to get the survivor to do or stop doing something, feels a strong sense of ownership over the survivor. They may use controlled substances and they are resistant to change. So here are some warning signs: a history of violence, substance abuse, breaking or striking things in anger. I truly believe that if someone is angry and they punch a wall near you, they are telling you that that could have been you. This is what they can do to you. It's a form of intimidation. Jealousy, controlling behaviors, quick involvement, unrealistic expectations, isolation, use of privilege, cruelty to animal and children, rape or use of force and sex, blame others for their problems, blame others for their feelings. These are red flags that you would want to pay attention to. And so this was just the introduction. There are so many other things that we're going to share with you, but this is just a brief introduction into what is domestic violence. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. My email address is DeborahH@DACESMI.org. Thank you.